So you're either here because you want to learn the very basics of making a site, or you're just bored. Either way, learning how to make a site is the first step in becoming a web developer, and it's also a great way to enhance your problem-solving skills. I'll be going over the essentials of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and jQuery. The only tool you really need is an integrated development environment, or IDE. Some common IDEs are Notepad++ and Visual Studio Code, the latter of which I would recommend. A link to download it will be in item 2 of the description. Part 1, HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. HTML isn't actually a programming language, it's a markup language, meaning absolutely no logic or scripting is required. Rather, you place elements on the page by writing in their tags. Some of the most common tags are H1 through H6, which are headers, P for paragraph, A for anchor, which is the technical term for a link, IMG, you can probably guess what this one is, OL and UL for ordered and unordered lists respectively, and LI for the list items, input to create buttons, checkboxes, and text boxes, among other things, label to create labels for inputs, and lastly, div to serve as a section of a page. As you may have noticed, some of these tags require a closing tag, and some don't. Tags that do require a closing tag can actually have other elements inside of them, which I'll demonstrate later. There's one more thing before we can get into actually coding: attributes. As can be seen with the input types, all tags can take an attribute value pair that gives them more information on how to function. While we're on the topic of attributes, the most important two that you need to learn how to use are class and ID. Class won't really come in useful for this tutorial, so I'll just focus on ID. ID is a unique name for an element, which is very useful for referring to the element directly in JavaScript code. While more than one element can have a class, only one element can have an ID. Now, that was a lot of information to dump in such a small amount of time, so let's start working on a site. For this example, I'll be making a simple calculator. Firstly, open up VS Code and click File, Open Folder. Right-click or press Ctrl-Shift-N to create a new folder. I'm going to call it Calculator Demo, but you can call it whatever you'd like. Then open it and click Select Folder. We'll need to create the file index.html. You can click on this button up here, and then type index.html. This will be the main page of the site. To pull up a template for the HTML, we can type exclamation point and tab. Before we actually begin work on the site, we should open it in a web browser. Click Ctrl-S to save. You'll see that this dot turned into an X when we saved it. Then right-click on the file over here, and then click Reveal in File Explorer. Then double-click the file to open it in Chrome. If it didn't open for you, you can always drag it into Chrome as well. You'll notice that it's blank. Of course, that's because we haven't done anything yet. Now we should start adding elements to the site. I'll start out with a H1 header, which is the biggest of the 6, and we'll simply call the page Calculator. Then make an input of type number. This will be a place for the user to enter a number. I'm also going to give it an ID for later. ID equals number input 1. Next up, let's make 4 buttons, one for each operation. You may have noticed earlier that there's an input of type button, but there's actually a whole nother element just called button as well, which I believe works better for the purpose of teaching. That's because we can more easily put text inside of the button, like so. I'll give each one a unique ID. Let's do button add, and for the rest of them, button subtract, button multiply, and button divide. Add another input of type number with an ID of number input 2. Lastly, add a p tag with the ID of output. We can do this quickly by typing p hashtag output and pressing tab. And then the text inside of it, result, will appear here. If we save and view the site, make sure to refresh, we can see that all of these elements now exist. The only problem with it is that it looks extremely ugly. Part 2, CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets and is the main way to adjust the visuals of a site. The main syntax of CSS is this, where P is the selector, color is a property, and red is the value for that property. To create a CSS file, we can add a new file and simply call it styles.css. To start, let's define a couple colors. We'll do this by using the :root selector. For the property, we'll do 2 dashes in the name of the color. I'll call this one dark, and I'll make it an orangey black color. Since it's not recommended to use pure black or pure white on a website, I'll make the light color an off-white as well. I'll make it an orangey off-white sort of color. Lastly, to add contrast, I'll define an accent color as a somewhat vibrant blue. Then to actually apply these colors, use the body selector. To change the background color of the page, the background-color property is used, and we'll have the color be var light. To set the color for text, we can do color, and we'll make it var dark. Now, if we save, go to Chrome, and refresh, nothing's happened. That's because you need to tell the HTML file to use the CSS file. This can be done by going to the HTML file, and at the end of this head tag, add a link tag. The rel attribute should be style sheet, and then for the href, this should be a link to the CSS file. For this example, it'd be /styles.css. Save, and then you can go back into the site, refresh, and you can see that the changes have been made. To make this look a bit better, let's change the font and move the content closer to the center of the page. To change the font, we can simply edit the font-family property to be sans-serif, which is a less formal font type. Then we'll add a max width to the body of 1000 pixels. We'll save, and when we test again, you'll see the font change worked. However, the page is still all the way to the left. This is where margins come in. A margin is the space around an element. You can edit the margin for one side specifically with margin left, margin right, margin top, or margin bottom. You can also edit all the margins at the same time with simply margin. Putting one value in changes it for all sides. 2 values makes the first one top bottom and the second one left and right. With this in mind, if we apply margin 0 auto to the body element, it will center the main content on the page. Increasing the max width will decrease the spacing around the body, and decreasing max width will increase spacing around the body. Now let's work on these inputs. There's by default a lot going on with these inputs, so I'm going to start out with doing all unset to clear all the default styles. Do margin 0 10 pixels to give them some spacing on the left and right. It's going to be a lot easier if we could see the inputs, so give them a background color of var dark and a text color of var light. It's a good idea to make these a bit shorter, so let's add a max width of 80 pixels. There's just one problem left with them. They're super thin, and the number butts up right against the left edge. To our rescue is padding. It's really similar to margin, except instead of being the space around the element, it's the space between the main content of the element and its edges. To demonstrate, I'll add a padding of 10 pixels to the inputs. It now looks much better. Moving on to the buttons, let's start out again by unsetting all of the default styles. Adding a background color of var accent this time, and a color of var dark. Let's also do a margin of 8 pixels and padding of 16 pixels. They look a lot better already. But there's some other things we can do to make them look even better. To increase the size of the labels and bold them, you can do font size, larger, and font weight, bold. They still look rather sharp, so to round the edges, we can add a border radius property. The higher this number, the more rounded the corners are, so let's just go with 8 pixels. What still seems off though, however, is the fact that when you hover over the buttons, the cursor doesn't change to the pointer like it usually does for clickable elements. To change this, we can edit the cursor property to be pointer. There we go. Still a bit off though. This is because there's no animations. Usually when you hover or click on a button, the color changes slightly. To change this, you'll have to add new selectors for only the hovered and clicked states of the buttons. Type out the button selector, add a colon, and then the state you're editing. For hovered, that's hover, and for clicked, that's active. To slightly change the color, add a filter for the brightness. So that's filter, brightness, and then in the parentheses, we can do 110% to make it a bit brighter, and for active, 90% to make it a bit darker. This immediate change is a bit odd, so as a final change to the buttons, add a transition property. This takes 3 values: the property to animate, that being filter, the time it should take, 0.15 seconds, sounds good, and the type of transition. I've found that ease in out looks the best, which will slow the animation down at the beginning and the end, and speed it up near the middle. Testing again, it looks a lot better with the subtle transitions. Last step for CSS, let's style the output paragraph. While we could just use P as a selector, let's select the ID of the element instead. To do this, type a hashtag and the ID, that being output. Let's make the background color var accent, the color var light, add 20 pixels of padding, and make the font size large. The P tag actually stretches for the full length of the body tag. To change this, set the width to fit content, which will change the width of the element to the width of whatever's inside of it. The only problem now is that our site doesn't do anything. That's where JavaScript comes in. Part 3, JavaScript and jQuery. JavaScript is, unlike HTML and CSS, an actual programming language. It's how you use logic and reasoning to give functionality to a page. jQuery is a library for JavaScript that makes some aspects of the language a lot easier, so I'll be teaching the usage of it as well. To create a JavaScript file, make a new file called script.js. To then select an element with jQuery, we can type $, parentheses, inside of the parentheses, 2 quotes. And then inside of the quotes, the CSS selector for the element. To change the text in the output paragraph, we can select it exactly like we did in CSS. And then we can type .text, parentheses, and a semicolon. Semicolons serve the same purpose in JavaScript as a period does in a sentence, ending a statement. In these parentheses, we can then type the text we want to change to, surrounded by quotes. Let's just do the result is like that. If we go back to the page and refresh, we can see that just like our CSS, nothing's happened. This is again because the index.html file doesn't know to use the script file. Go back to the HTML, and right before the closing body tag, make 2 script tags. For the second one, add a src attribute, which stands for source, and type /script.js. For the first one, however, we need to tell the page to use jQuery, since jQuery doesn't come with JavaScript. Replace the whole thing with this line, which can be found in item 3 of the description. Additionally, a link to all this code will be in item 1 of the description, in case you wish to see all of it. Save that, reload the page, and you'll see that the text in the paragraph has changed. Now let's change this so it happens when a button is clicked instead. Select the Add button, and write .on, open parenthesis, single quotes, click, comma, function, parentheses, space, open curly brace, and hit enter, and then put a semicolon at the end of that. We can now move this line into this section, and this will make the code only run when the button is clicked. To demonstrate, there we go. Now we're going to change this function to get the number from each of these inputs, add them together, and display that in this paragraph instead. To do this, I'll need to explain variables first. A variable is, in its simplest terms, a value that you can define and change depending on certain conditions. In JavaScript, you can define a variable with let and the name of the variable. You can also give it a value right away by typing equals and a value, called an integer if it doesn't have a decimal, and a float if it does. Characters surrounded by quotes, called a string, or true or false, called a Boolean value. In this case, you can declare a variable as the value from an input with let num1 equal $, parentheses, quotes, pound to select an ID, number dash input dash 1, because this is the ID that we chose earlier, then .val, parentheses, and a semicolon. We can do the same thing for the second value, except replace number input 1 with number input 2, and num1 with num2. And then we can declare output as num1 plus num2 semicolon. Lastly, we'll add this output variable to the string that we're outputting by simply typing plus output. Let's save, and if we test this by typing 5 and 3 and clicking plus, 5 plus 3 is apparently 53. This is because the value in the number box is actually a string of characters that just contains a number. To fix this, you'll need to do what's called parsing a variable. That can be done with parseInt parentheses. Whatever is inside of a parseInt is what is converted into a number. So we need to put all of this inside of a parseInt, save, and if we try it again, 5 plus 3 now correctly equals 8. The last step is to make the rest of these buttons work too. There's just 2 remaining features to learn: functions and if statements. A function is simply a section of code that can be ran whenever, and it's really helpful for this example. Let's create a function called doMath, and in these parentheses, we can declare what we call a parameter. A parameter is just a variable that must be provided when a function is used. I'm going to call the parameter operation for the type of operation we'll be doing. Next, I'll use an if statement. An if statement checks a condition, and then only if the condition is true, the code inside of the if statement runs. So we'll check if operation equals, because that's how you compare in JavaScript, in quotes, so it's a string, add. And what I'm going to do for now is move all of this code into the doMath function. So if operation equals add, output equals num1 plus num2 semicolon. Up here, output can then be defined without a value. Then in the blank function up here, we'll call the doMath function with the argument add. Don't forget the semicolon at the end. Let's copy all this code and paste it 3 times. So we have one for each button. The subtract button calls doMath with the parameter subtract. The multiply button calls it with multiply, and the divide button with divide. Our last change is to then add more if statements. If operation equals subtract, output equals num1 minus num2. If it is multiply, output is 1 times 2. Note that you have to use an asterisk instead of the x to multiply. Lastly, we can check for division, and if so, divide. Now let's save, and if we test this with 10 and 2, 10 plus 2 is 12, 10 minus 2 is 8, 10 times 2 is 20, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. To summarize, HTML allows you to place elements on a web page. CSS allows you to edit the visuals of these elements, and then JavaScript gives functionality to them. As mentioned earlier, all this code is available in the description. I would highly recommend that you now take a class on web development if this guide interested you. This was, after all, just a very basic introduction to making sites. I hope this helped. Happy coding!